Hey guys, we're doing this for the first time, so I spent 2 minutes on introducing myself and the meaning of all of this. I'm Andrew. I founded a company called Homsters about 4 years ago. What we do is we work with property portals like Classified, helping them get into transaction faster by giving them a plug-and-play solution for the new development segment. And the panel is called, Whoops. We're going to talk about common mistakes of our industry and how to learn from them. Can I get the clicker for a sec? Yeah. The question is, have you ever seen a leader who said, I became a leader by listening to a success story and copying it? That obviously never happened. How leaders become leaders is by going out there, trying, failing, learning, trying again, failing, learning, and moving forward. That's how you become a leader. So naturally, failing becomes a very important part of the process. Everybody's going to tell you, every business coach. So, we get inspired by success stories to move forward to start a business. But where we actually learn is by mistakes of our own, and there's actually even wiser people who learn on mistakes of others. And when I realized this, what would help me build the business faster is if I would get also access not only to success stories, but to mistakes that people make so I don't repeat them or at least change something. So I approached Simon with this idea saying, look, Simon, we got to balance the two, because in most of the conferences, we spend 99% of time talking about success stories. But that's not where the learning is. So we have to balance it, at least have, I'm sorry, I called it a fucked up panel, at least one of it, of where we talk about learnings from bad experiences. And, Simon was good enough to say, okay, let's do it. And also, I'm very glad, because the big problem with learning from mistake is that, there's no forum for it, which we just created here. But also, there's a lack of people who have the courage to stand up and say, you know what? It wasn't all roses. I screwed up a couple times in the process. So I'm very happy to announce that we found two of the leaders, of heavy hitters of the industry, to lead the way again and say, have the courage to step up here and share the stories. So please applaud to welcome to the stage Simon.
Okay. Thank you.
And Steve.
How we fucked up.
First of all, thanks for joining. This is the first time for me in this thing, so we're all virgins in this. I'll try to put in categories to structure the discussion and to keep it swing. Mm-hmm. So let's jump straight into it, you guys. The big one. If I ask you guys, what's your biggest mistake, which you believe sets you back the most, what would it be?
Which week?
There's so many, right?
After you.
Yeah, I think for me, well, first of all, I'd like to say thanks for Andrew for organising this panel, and also thanks for selecting me to represent your fuck up and failure. So I feel very warm and fuzzy inside to be selected. So thank you for that. In terms of biggest mistake, I guess for me personally, one of the most challenging and probably what felt like the biggest mistake at the time was 2011, 2012. We were just at that stage, just in Singapore. We'd built Singapore into a profitable company, and it was growing really, really nicely. And we said, right, now we've conquered Singapore, let's just cut and paste and just roll it out across the rest of Southeast Asia. Wouldn't that be easy? So that was wrong. So we went from one country to 4 countries in 4 months. And the whole of our organization at that stage was just focused on one country, on Singapore. And so Singapore was doing well, and we took the Singapore resources and said, right, now we need to roll out a website in Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand. We've got to build 12 apps for the consumers, for the agents in all these countries. We've got to go away and hire 200 people and get the business up and running and launch them, etc. So we relied on all existing Singapore resources focused on Singapore product, tech, finance, HR, sales, marketing, and said, guys, come on, we're rolling out all these countries now. We thought they'd be excited about it, but it almost broke the company. We stretched morale to breaking point, so that was pretty challenging. The product machine and innovation machine, which we had really good and working really well in Singapore, ground to a halt. The performance in Singapore suffered tremendously for about 2 years. And we hired 200 people and 200 new gurus, and they quickly became ex-gurus because we weren't putting strict quality control in place. And so we were hiring fast, but then also losing them very quickly. We were pulling the sales resource in from Singapore to help hire salespeople and train salespeople in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. So whilst they were doing that, they weren't doing their day job. Same on a marketing point of view as well. That was a particularly challenging time, and both from a organisation point of view and also just personally as well. We were spending pretty much every week just living and breathing at these markets and trying to work out how these markets work, hiring people and this kind of thing. So that was pretty extreme.
Well, we'll get back to the learnings in a second. Simon, your biggest mistake.
I got several. I don't know which is the biggest, but there's certainly a few there. But they have a common theme amongst them: overconfidence.
All right.
Right. That's the common theme. So the first I'm going to sort of relay to you is as an investor, and it goes in the category of you're in one game and you're doing well in the game. You understand it, and the online real estate game. You've been there for a while. You've seen a lot of things, and you think, great, I understand how to invest in companies. And invest in similar, and you might even invest in similar online classified sites, and they do well. And then you think, well, this investing game's sort of quite easy. And so I put a lazy $500,000 into wasn't lazy in those days, into this other company that was not in the online classified space, but thinking, no, I can apply the lessons and it makes a lot of sense. And this is not the biggest one. And in the category of, that was a stupid thing to do, what I realised rapidly was, A, I didn't actually understand anything about what I'd invested in. B, these guys were taking me for a ride and paying themselves a fair chunk of money out the back end. And C, I had to do that twice to learn the lesson. The first time, I want to say more fall on you or me or whatever it is, and twice. So I managed to blow through two really bad investments, but with the very same common theme. And the lesson, which I'll tell you briefly, was A, stick to what you know, don't get overconfident, and then go deep. And then related to the overconfidence thing, because I think when you're on a roll, you tend to do it, and it's similar to yours. It's about rapid expansion. And it was sort of when we were at the REA group, doing very well in Australia, we knew I think the strategy was right, the execution was could be better. It was about saying, we knew that in Australia we were leading, and we knew that that's going to be hard to overtake, and then we were thinking, well, what's next? We've got to build the next roadmap, the next thing. And so we thought, well, we understand this online game, we're doing very well, we understand what's happening in Australia, let's go to England, let's buy a business there. It's called Property Finder. That'll be pretty easy. We'll buy this one in Italy. We can do that. And suddenly we're in Luxembourg, we're in Italy, we're in England, we're in Dubai, and so on. And we think we're fantastic at juggling, and all we're doing is basically preparing ourselves to drop all the balls that we're juggling. And what happens in that process is that you have no mechanism to fall back onto something, right? So you're into it now, because when you've spent, I don't know what we spent now. I don't know how much we spent in England, £10 million or £15 million or whatever it was to buy it at that point in time.
That hurts.
You're in. Well, it didn't hurt me personally. Well, it did eventually hurt me personally because I didn't have a job. But it did in the short term. It hurt because you then realise that A, it's not as easy as you think it is. B, you're on a plane from Melbourne to London to Italy to back to Melbourne, and it's just a nightmare. You're relying on people to execute out there for you, but they're not always aligned to what you want them to do. You may have faith, they may be giving you bullshit information back because they're hiding their mistakes, and you're the one who's got to communicate it to a board.
So in a short sentence, what did you guys learn from this experience? What was the biggest takeaway?
For me, I guess it was one, Southeast Asia is not a homogeneous mass, not surprisingly. A little bit naive to think that you could just cut and paste. Every single market that we entered into had its own complexities in terms of not just the organisational challenges of hiring, but also in terms of the competitive structure, economic maturity, but also how people find property. You know, we basically took the Singapore way, which was people know the condo name. But in Thailand, for example, it was all around location and the neighborhood. Siloam, Sukhumvit, Tonglo, and so map became very important in Thailand, but it wasn't so important in Singapore because it's so small. Yeah, so I think the big takeaway for me was don't underestimate the complexities of going regional, because we went from a very simple Singapore structure to the complexity level goes factor of 10 when you expand regionally, and then suddenly you have to put this regional layer in place, which is very, very expensive and quite hard, and so complexity cost goes up through the roof as you expand internationally. Okay. So that's probably the main one.
Thanks.
For me, get a balance between my head and my gut is the way I think about it, right? In that, no, because and the way I think about it is, it was the degree of the ego going, say, well, we can do this, I can invest in this, or we can go and do that as a company, right? Yep. Both same core elements around it, if I'm being brutally honest with myself. But in my gut, I knew some of it was wrong, right? Like I
the
knew,
ego one. Right?
I knew that I should not invest in these guys, but I thought, now I can make this work, right? And it's that tug between, I want to make it work to prove to myself that I can do it, but the gut's saying, oh, come on, what the hell are you doing, right? And sometimes you've got to absolutely go with your intuition rather than the head and trying to be super logical and super analytical about it at the time. So I think the lesson learned is A, stick to what you know and just do it really well and continue to do it really well, and then slowly expand from it. And B is, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck, right? In this case, a fuck up, and don't invest in it or don't do it.
All right, guys.
Okay.
Thanks for that. Let's keep moving because you're not getting away with one. I got 5 categories.
Oh, shit.
Okay. So
I really should have read these questions, shouldn't I?
So I sent you them before.
I know. That was another fuck up.
So prepare. That's a lesson. Some strategy. Let's go to should have done it differently. So execution and operation. So a good idea which went sideways because of failing execution, and how do you recover from that? So, it was a good idea, screw up execution. What would you mention? I think you brought up.
I think for me, the one that we should have done and should do, and I guess repeatedly is a challenge, is talent and people. So all of our businesses, I'm sure you'll agree, rely on people. It's not just technology. And finding really good people in the business is what makes the business succeed. But it's also very, very hard to find that. And I guess, if I reflect a little bit on the early days when we had no money, no brand, no credibility, nothing really to sort of hang our hats on, just selling a dream, naturally we didn't hire necessarily the best people. And despite the fact that we said, look, we had this culture and value which is really important to us, if I'm really, truly honest, do we compromise that? Yes, we did. Going back to the point you were making just now, Simon, about around gut. Trusting your gut, I think, around that. So I've got a lot of examples of where, one of our early hires, for example, employee number 3, great coder, very ambitious guy, Chinese guy, really wanted to succeed, brought him into sales. He did a great job in sales, brought a lot of money in. Was always a loner, always the rest of the team were complaining about him because he didn't care about anybody else, he just cared about himself. But he was very ambitious and driven, and we then promoted him to run our mortgage business, our loan business, Loan Guru. And then fast forward 2 years, we found out that he was basically siphoning off business from us.
Ouch.
So he was stealing from us. And if you ask me at any point during those 3 or 4 years when he was with us, should I have fired him? The gut said absolutely. Should have fired him. We had another issue where we had 2 of our top sales guys who at one stage were responsible for 80% of the revenue when we were small. So massively reliant on these. And they both came to us and said, right, we are quitting unless you double our salaries. And we went, shit, And I had sleepless nights, and I got so stressed about this because 80% of our revenues with these 2 guys, they walk out, they take it to our competitor. The business absolutely screwed, so reliant on 2 people. And I hated myself for it at the time. I thought, right, I have to compromise my values. So what did I do, or what did we do? We said, okay, we'll keep one of you. The other one just go. And we said, you're the best, we want to keep you. And then we just built a hierarchy around him and basically diluted his power to the point where he was no longer so indispensable, to the point where we could say, okay, thanks very much, you've done your job. But it was compromising the culture and values. And we've had country managers who've bribed customers. We've had country managers who've basically pushed contracts to their wife. We've had country managers who've been alcoholics, all sorts like that. And all of these, by the way, went through a rigorous process of pre-screening, interviews, panel sessions, etc. And at the time, we as the organisation and the board said, okay, these are good hires. But then little alarm bells start ringing, and in almost 100% of occasions, that gut is absolutely right. And so, yeah, trusting the gut, I think, was probably one of my key things around people. Still very hard to get good people.
So what's the lesson learned? I heard somewhere that if you take all of your failed relationship personally, you take the middle point of how long you've been with somebody, that's the point when you made the decision. Everything else was just cutting it longer. So you're saying that's the same thing. If your gut tells you that somebody is not a part of the organization, just let it go, right?
Trust your gut and then act really fast. We would try, prolonging it. Say, oh, maybe the guy can change. You sit down, do personal development plans. Like, guy, look, these are the areas we've got concerns about. This is what you need to do. And yes. 6, 9, 12 months later, 99.99% of the time, the people don't change. And that gut instinct is absolutely right. So you should have made a decision 12 months beforehand. When you're really, really small and reliant on a small number of people, it's really, really hard to do that, I'd say. So for those of you in earlier stage companies, it is a tough. As the company starts to scale, you become less reliant on certain people and the processes are in place. So you don't feel quite held to ransom. You can perhaps be a little bit more true to the culture and values.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Simon,
yeah,
what should have you done differently?
It's
the top one, come on.
There's one, isn't the number. The one that pops to mind at the moment is a business I invested in. It was a good idea. I'm not going to say exactly what it is because it'll be obvious who it is to some people. The challenge was, the reason it failed was the governance structure for the company wasn't right. So one person had too much of a say. Secondly, the say they had was clearly taking in the wrong direction and everyone knew it, but they didn't want to hear why it was going in the wrong direction. So that was sort of but the underlying idea was a good idea. I can't say exactly what it is, but it was a good idea.
Oh, come on, Simon.
No, I ain't going to say it.
Come on.
It's a safe space. Nobody's watching, Simon. Nobody's listening. It's safe.
I do have another one between us. I'm not going to say it either, right? So, but it was actually a good idea. Fundamentally made a lot of sense. It was a business that it needed to go through a number of evolutions before it got to the right model, and I think now would have been the time to be at the right model, and I see some other people doing it and doing it right. But because of the governance structure and the CEO and what was executed, and they were very pig-headed, would be the best word, about what they wanted to do, and quite deaf to other ideas, the execution went sideways. Right? And as the execution went sideways, you couldn't really recover. So personally, my method of recovery was to get cents in the dollar back on my investment. I sold it back to the person, and they are now dealing with their own decisions as a 100% shareholder. But I think the way you normally recover from these is that you either inject yourself in and take a role. A leadership role is about the only way you can do it, or you have to walk away. I think trying to continue to work with what is fundamentally a bad relationship makes no sense. And it's actually no different to what you're talking about before. If you've got a bad employee, you've got a bad employee, right? And they may not be bad as people, they're just bad with the connection with what the organisation's goal is, whatever that is. Because you need to have a bunch of people walking in lockstep to achieve a certain outcome. And if they can't all walk in lockstep to that outcome, you've got to exit some people and find the right people, because you just don't have time to re-educate, especially in small businesses. So I think that's the lesson learned out of that.
So that's interesting, because both of you said actually that the execution all comes down to people actually. So any idea with bad people will fail, which I think is a great lesson to learn.
Yes.
You can take the best idea, if the people are wrong, it's just not going to fly.
Come on, robots.
Yep. All right, not to let you guys off the hook, not to make it sound like you can recover from all the ideas. The shit happens category. Well, sometimes you just screw up. Example. So, just give us an example where you just flat up unnecessarily screwed up. It was only your fault. There was nobody to blame. And that was it.
Oh, jeez. Where do I go? I'll tell you brutally honest. When I was running the REA group, and the reason I am now, I was booted out the door by News Corp, it's about management of expectations. Okay, and so that was absolutely me screwing up, because it wasn't reading the situation clearly enough and understanding that as the REA group went from being irrelevant, not even a real business as one of them would describe it, to being a $1 billion business at that point in time and starting to be a big chunk of the balance sheet, was not understanding the politics and what that meant to them. And so keep driving in a certain way which they didn't like, and not therefore changing or at least listening more to what was needed by a 64% shareholder in that process. It sometimes pays to listen to your major shareholder, led to the inevitable clash. And when a CEO clashes with a 64% shareholder, the 64% shareholder wins 100% of the time. So that's a real screw up at the end of the day.
So what did you take away from that? I'm sure it was a painful experience.
Don't have a 64% shareholder. No. What I took away from it was work in environments with people that you could partner. The beer test, it came up before. I can't remember who had it on their thing. Justin, I think, had it. Justin Sway had it on his thing. Got to pass the beer test for people you work with, because at the end of the day, you're going to spend a lot of time, and even with people that you report to, you've got to have a good, constructive, open relationship with them, is what you take away, right? And you've got to be able to have the good conversations and the bad conversations. And it's got to be done in an environment without fear. I'm going to have a bad conversation, this has gone wrong, what's going to happen? Right? And I'll be brutally honest, at the Petula Group, we set some forecasts, we had to readjust the forecasts, the share market didn't like doing it, but we had an internal conversation around it, about setting expectations. The company's still growing really well, but it was more about missing expectations than it was about poor performance. And the honest conversation was, well, this went wrong, and it went wrong for that reason. Part of it's our own internal fault. Great. It wasn't then a case of let's have retribution on people, because that leads to zero outcome that's positive, right? We said, okay, well, let's fix that up. Let's reset expectations, and let's then move forward. So I think it's about how do you make sure you have those open, honest conversations, so that you can get through the shit when the shit is bad. And honestly, and regarding Petula, where we've got an exceptional board, and we will be able to go through an infinite amount of shit, and we will sort of hold arms, lock together, and help each other through it, even if one of us causes a shit, right? Not saying anyone did cause a shit, but even if one of us did, we wouldn't point fingers. It wouldn't become that sort of game. And I think that is super critical in, especially businesses that are going through rapid growth, because you've got to be able to have the honest conversations, understand that things will go wrong, right? They'll go wrong. Sometimes you can stop them, sometimes you can't see them, but they are your fault. Other times they're not your fault.
All right. Okay.
When politics don't get out of the way.
Yeah, it's got to be in an apolitical environment. So I think if you can create that, not only within your team, whether it's the C level or another level or at the board level, it doesn't really matter. And not only at those levels, but also at these levels, going between them.
Yep.
It's super important. So that's sort of how I'd handle the shit happens one.
All right. Thanks for sharing. Steve?
Yeah.
Do we get a hug
I'm
up?
conscious of time.
I'll hug you later.
Yeah. Probably the most stupid mistake I made was early part of my career. I was working on the deal of my career. I was working in telecoms in those days, and I was working on a $10 million contract with Vodafone, and my counterpart was the head of procurement for Vodafone. and extremely tough negotiator. And I always left the conversation feeling like he'd always won that conversation, and did a far better job at negotiating than I did. A really super tough guy, so it was in the middle of this conversation, but I wanted the deal to happen. But I was updating my team via email and just saying, this is what's happened, but the guy is just such an asshole, he's such a tough negotiator, blah, blah, blah. And I copied him on the email. And then one of my guys said, do you realize you've copied him on the email? I went, oh, shit. I more than shit, I actually really got quite stressed about it, because this was my big deal. And I thought of blowing it, so I stewed on it for about 2 hours, and then plucked up courage to give the guy a call, and he just roasted me for a long time, and we're now friends, but eventually the deal happened. He was professional enough to sort of see through it, so I got away with it, but it could have been a bit more, could have been worse.
So they see, the
lesson from that is just don't copy your clients or people slagging up on emails. Just be a bit more careful, I guess.
Be careful what you say and where you say it.
Yeah. All right, guys. So on to the next one, which is shouldn't have spent that money. You guys, have raised the money. You guys are serial investors in the space too. Mm-hmm. So what was the biggest mishandle on money, or taking money from the wrong person? How did you deal with that? Steve, let's get you started.
I do some angel investing. Have done since 2004, and I've got probably higher than VC failure rate on that. Not particularly good at that. I've got a whole bunch of failures around various companies I've invested in, so I can share those over a beer tonight. From a business point of view, not so much not taking money from, but we've raised $230 million from investors, and we've had really aligned and supportive shareholders. Been thankful for that for the last 6 or 7 years, apart from about 12 months with one of them. So in 2012, we took a round from Deutsche Telekom, which had ownership of Scout24, which had dating, finance, cars, and property websites around Europe, but wanted to focus on emerging markets, and we were their first foray into emerging markets and invested through us. And we had a fantastic relationship with them for 2 years. And they bent over backwards. They said, whoever you want to bring from our organization, fly them over. You pay for flights and accommodation, but you get free consultancy, whether it's software development, network security, branding, pricing, SEO, online marketing, etc. We had fantastic support for 2 years. And then Deutsche Telekom, CEO left and the CFO took over. When a CFO takes over as a CEO, there's a very different story, and it's all around consolidation. So Deutsche Telekom said, right, we're letting 10,000 people go. We're going to focus on the core business in Germany and the US. And by the way, this digital business is so small anyway, we'll sell the majority of it to a private equity company. That private equity company had a very different agenda, which was how do we IPO this business as quick as possible? And so they stripped out the finance business, the dating business, sold off Switzerland, and consolidated down to cars and property Germany, predominantly Scout24, and hired a new CEO. And so suddenly we had, from a highly aligned, supportive shareholder to one who was extremely non-aligned, and we had 12 months of just friction, heated discussions around what the strategy should be, which in their view was consolidate everything back to Singapore and just squeeze the profit out of Singapore, and ours was still investment mode. And we had, as a founder, that was probably one of the not very pleasant times working with shareholders, and we struggled with it. We had lots of heated on conversations with them, and failed to see eye to eye. So by the end of the year, we basically said, look, this is just not working. So what do we do about it? So when we went to raise our last round 2.5 years ago, we had two objectives. One was to primary money into the company, and two was to try and somehow buy these guys out, to get them off our back. And we were fortunate that one of our shareholders wanted to write big checks, and were able to get rid of them. But that was a really uncomfortable time from a business point of view with a shareholder.
So if, just in a short sentence to give Simon some time, it's like, how do you defend against that? This was out of your control. What can you do?
Yeah, well, at that stage it's very hard to decide to mitigate against it, but my philosophy around investment has been, constantly, kissing the frogs, as I call it, so constantly engaging, keeping investors warm. So when we wanted to go and raise money, we had 10 companies who wanted to put money in, and so we'd kept them warm through the period of time, and we continue to do that as well. We continue to talk to investors, even if we don't need the money or we don't see sight of needing the money, we might need the money at some point.
Right.
I already talked about a couple of my dud investments, and I can talk about more, and I don't really want to. But taking the money, I was thinking about that question, right? I used to be on a board of a company in Australia called Redbubble that many of you may know of. It's now listed, but this was. I was on the board of that 5 years ago, and I was on the board for about 5 years. So I invested 10 years ago when it was a very, very young company. I knew the CEO, a guy called Martin Hosking, who used to be in the office next to me, right, when we were at McKinsey, both of us. It's funny, I was in one office, he was in the other office, and a guy called Lee Jasper was in the other office, and he was the guy who created Aconex. So we all went went our separate ways, and all ended up in online listed internet companies. But what was interesting, we were on the board of Redbubble, and we were raising money in like these early days, and as the company wasn't super clear on its direction, what it was doing, but it was moving in a direction, not necessarily the right direction, but didn't have a problem because the CEO, I trusted Martin because he's a smart guy. We took some money from this other guy. Another guy was in another office in the area, right? And we knew him. He was a bit weird, right? As some of these consultants are. But we took his money. A good family name in Melbourne and so on. It looked good on the board, share register. But the company was sort of, we'd sort of had these projections, and we weren't quite hitting the projections on the growth and such. And he became one of these agitated, irate, painful shareholders in a small company. Right? He's ringing every day. He's saying, "What the hell are you doing?" He starts getting legal letters saying you raised money on this thing, you didn't do this. And it got really quite nasty for a while, and we're on the board going, "Oh shit, what are we going to do?" Because this guy is a pain in the ass, and he's got access to a lot of money, right? They're not a poor family; they've got a fair chunk of change. So, but he's a bit screwy in the brain. So he wasn't being logical in what he wanted. His expectations and reality were just disconnected. And this went on for about 18 months, right? And it got very heated, and of course the CEO, who's there 24/7, he's taking a lot of the flack, and he's getting really pissed. But it's not sort of Martin to get. He gets angry, but he doesn't really get angry. And the only way we got out of it was we eventually, as some of the board, just bought this guy's shareholding out, and we bought it at, I don't know, maybe 10 cents or 12 cents or something, whatever it is. But the biggest joke now is today is it's a $2 share, right? And so if the guy just shut up and let us get on with that job, right? He would have got a much better outcome. But he was one of these agitators who wanted to insert himself, wanted to tell you how to run the business, even though he was quite disconnected from what was happening. So he was only seeing sort of part of it, and he didn't like the part he saw.
So Siegel investment and Siegel management, right?
Yeah, but there's sort of two lessons out of this. A, be careful who you take your money from, right? And even if you know them, right, just because they're a friend or an acquaintance or a colleague or whatever, doesn't make it a good investment. It actually probably buys you a lot more pain than you want because there's a level of commitment to them. And the second thing is set very clear expectations up front on what you're going to share information-wise. Share it consistently. Okay? Provide clear channels for communication, positive and negative, but make sure it's done within a defined procedure, because you can't allow what was a highly disruptive shareholder, and he was being disruptive because he was trying to force us to buy him out at a high price, right? Eventually we said, no, we'll buy you out for this price. Okay? I think that's the way to think about it.
All right. Unfortunately, we're out of time, guys. I'll hit 2 more categories, but...
Do them super quick, honest. I didn't know. I should have read the email.
All right. I called it James, I need you in my office now. Meaning, how do you manage failure in the organization? Like, if you can share that quickly, because we know that it's part of the journey. At the same time, you really, you can't let people get away with everything.
Yeah.
And it's especially hard here in Asia, I guess, where it's such a, failure is a personal thing.
Yep.
How do you build that culture in the organization?
Yeah, I can answer this one, and I think the guys who are here from REA, when I was at REA, we tried to, it's about the culture you create. You set expectations, okay? Either you set an expectation of like a military hierarchy. You do as I say, don't argue, and then come to me if you want, even go for a glass of water. Or you create an environment that is different, and we created one which said, look, we trust you. You're employed to do a job, do your job, we trust you. Seek forgiveness, don't ask permission, but don't keep seeking forgiveness, right? Because eventually you'll be seeking the door in that process, right? And then we created a culture of don't let perfection get in the way of better. So we didn't want people to create a Rolls Royce when a VW Beetle will do the job for you. So if you set the right expectations, and then you say, go and play in that environment, right? And you say, go. And Scott Holmes is around here somewhere. Where's Scott? Are you here, Scott? Oh, he's disappeared. He was a great exponent of understanding the environment to play in and then leveraging it and that was fantastic because he created a lot of value in the organisation in those days. But when you do get people who step outside the boundaries, and someone reminded me, I think it was actually Scott reminded me, actually last night. He reminded me of this, we had this guy, employee, right? And we had the boundaries of, and one of the rules we ran these conferences like this. And the rule was, I don't care what you do the night before, just turn up at 9 o'clock the next day, be sober, participate. This guy comes, he turns up, right? And we did this little thing, stand up, say, oh yeah, my name's Scott and I'm drunk and blah, blah, blah. That's what he said, right? And I said, well, you've sort of, and in front of everyone, I said, well, you've sort of got a slight problem, haven't you, right? You broke the rule. The rule was turn up, sober, participate, the norm. So I said, turn around, go out that door, get in the plane, go back to Brisbane, right? Which he had to do. And by the way, you're paying for your ticket, okay? So we set very clear rules, very clear expectations. You give them a lot of leeway in that, but that's a trivial example, it's a real example. But it's no different to people who in your organisation who aren't performing. You have to give people a chance to perform, you have to give them opportunities, you have to tell them where it's going wrong, but it's the same thing. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, and it ain't going to work, cut the relationship. Because it's not good for them, and it's not good for you. They can't be happy, you can't be happy. So I think when you need you in my office, it depends on what it is. If the organisation is failing, they are failing within the expectations, as long as the expectations are realistic, then you have to be swift in the process. Give them some opportunity, but then be swift. The other thing is if the organisation is failing, is an interesting question, because a number of the organisations I've been involved in have had to go through cost reduction. And cost reduction equals less people. By definition, it can't be anything else but that. That's a very different conversation. And that's where you have to be very clear on what's happened, why it's happened, not blaming individuals, but we were targeted to do this, we staffed up to do this, we didn't achieve the outcome. It's a culmination of facts, some of it's performance by individuals, some of it's performance, the strategy, some of it's the quality of the product, it'll be multiple things. But because of that, we need to downsize. It's got to be clear, it's got to be fast, it's got to be done once. If you do it bit by bit by bit, they're just waiting for the next one, and then the next bit, and the next bit. So I think that's the two ways I would answer that question.
Okay, thanks. Steve, can you share on that? Because
yes.
PropertyGuru is
Simon's
multiple cultures.
Answer the question. I think the key thing I think would be around trust, and how do you create that culture of trust inside the organisation, which is a challenge in itself, I think. But trust starts with being transparent, so over communicating and communicating. I think it also means a little bit around leading from the front, being humble. So if someone in your team screws up, then you take responsibility for it. So look, I take responsibility for that. I took the decision and it was my fault. And the leader's taking responsibility for it rather than the individual pointing the finger 3 layers down the organisation and pointing on that individual. And likewise, the flip side of that is when there's success, you praise the person who's had the success rather than you take all of the glory. So I think that level 5 leadership, humility, leading from the front, transparency, which leads to then trust. The other thing is really around the culture of innovation and experimentation. So, we've probably done this on steroids, maybe too much, but experimentation also leads to innovation, but also leads to failure. And so some of those experiments, and we've experimented around a whole different bunch of things, our loan guru business, our print organization, our events business, we experiment. And some of those work and some of them work for a period of time. You say, this is going to be around for 5 years. And some of them just plain do not work. But also putting your hand up when it doesn't work and taking responsibility for it. Okay. Say, look, we tried something, it didn't work. We've learned some lessons from it. You do a post-mortem, but a post-mortem is about understanding why and learning and then trying to do something again. And I think it's also failure accelerates when you try to do too much. You know, so there have been times in my organization where, you know, probably try to do too much, and you stretch the organization, and then that starts to lead to breakdowns and failure. So, you know, what we think about now is, like, if we can experiment, let's choose one big thing.
So focus.
Yeah, one big thing, and then let's allocate some resource to it, and not just allocate resource to experiment, but also if it's success, you make sure you plan the next year to put some resources to grow that success and invest in it, rather than do 10 things at the same time.
Cool. Okay, thanks, guys. I think we can take the questions towards beers. The whole purpose was to make it as the last session so we can continue, and beer should help in sharing. So I want to thank you both, guys, for leading the way, as always, for coming up and sharing. Guys, do you think this was useful? Raise your hand if you believe this was...
Okay, good. Thank you.